we'll be tackling this particular sci-fi environment. It's actually pretty similar to a tutorial done by Ducky3D. I'm sure you all know him, and I'll be linking his video down below, and it's definitely worth checking out. However, he focused it to be a still render created mainly using the Cycles engine. I'm going to be focusing on doing it in Eevee with my own twists. So without any more distractions, let's start the tutorial. In our default scene, we're going to go ahead and press X to delete our default cube, and then we'll press Shift A and add in a mesh plane, and we'll press S5 to scale it up by 5 units. Now we're going to go to the modifier tab over here and then add in a subdivision surface modifier, but we're going to change it to simple and increase the levels all the way to 6 in both the view as well as the render. Now we're going to go ahead and add in a displace modifier from here, and we'll press new to add in a new texture. So to change the texture, we're going to have to go to the texture properties down here and change the type from image or movie to clouds. Now, of course, the size is a bit too small and the strength is a bit too high. So we'll go ahead and change the size to something like 0.5. And in the modifier's properties, we'll change the strength as well to something like 0.2. Once you have that, we'll also go ahead and add in another subdivision surface modifier just to smooth things out even more, and we can change the levels view to 2 as well. Then we can go up to the object button over here and change it to shade smooth. Now, in case we want to increase the number of these things added in, if we press Alt D or Shift D and move it, you see it won't line up. To make sure that it lines up perfectly, what we can do is select it, and under the displace modifier, change the coordinates from local to global, and then when we press Shift DX, it'll always perfectly match up when we actually move it to the side. So you can see the actual bumps are matching up perfectly. So the problem with that is that when we actually change it to global, the size also changes. So we have to go back to our texture properties over here and just increase the size till we get something that we're happy with. So in this case, I'll go with a size of 2. Once we're happy with it, we'll also go to the materials and just add in a new material so that we don't have to link all the materials later on, and it'll just stay over here. So we'll call this surface. Now we can go ahead and create the other versions of it. So we'll press GZ minus 0.5 to just move it down by 0.5 units, and then press Alt D Z1 so that it moves up by exactly 1 unit. Another benefit of using the global coordinates over here is that when we actually duplicated it, it's not going to be a perfect duplicate of the thing. So we don't have to rotate it about any of the axes to make any changes because it already has been changed as we moved it up. So it's no longer a mirror image or a perfect fit or things like that. So now if you do want to place more copies of it, you can just go to 7 to go to the top view, switch on transparency with this button, then press B to box select and both the planes will get selected. Then you can press Alt D to duplicate it. First on the Y-axis, we'll just move it up by 10 units. You can press Ctrl to make sure that it snaps to grid. And once it's in the perfect place, just enter and then press Alt D Y and bring it down. And then press B for box select and just select all of these and then press Alt DX and again Alt DX. So once you've placed all of them, you have all of these, and now you can take your camera and press Alt G to clear location, Alt R to clear rotation, then RX90 and then press 7 to go into your top view and just grab it on the Y till it comes to the edge of our middle box, which is right about here. After that, you can select your light and then press Alt G to clear its location as well. Then you can press 0 to go into your camera view, select your camera, and then press RY and just rotate it to some angle that you like. So I think I'll go with this particular angle. Now you can go ahead and switch off transparency by toggling this button up here, and you get the entire scene. The next thing that we have to do is actually add in some object of interest. So we'll press Shift A and just search for a UV sphere, and then press Ctrl 2 to give it a subdivision surface of level 2, and then just scale it down, and that should be all right. We just have to make sure that it's small enough to not be touching the tops. So in this case, it is touching the top over there. So we'll just scale it down a little bit more, and that's all right. We also have to remember to go to Object and click on Shade Smooth so that we don't get any ridges while actually rendering. Once we're done with this, we can start off texturing and creating our entire scene. So to do that, we'll start off by setting all of our render defaults. So we'll switch on Ambient Occlusion, Bloom, Screen Space Reflections, and under Screen Space Reflections, we'll also switch on Refraction. Apart from that, we'll go to our output settings, change the frame rate to 30 frames per second, the end frame 300 so that it's going to be a 10-second long animation. Change the output to wherever you want it to be. File format is going to be FFmpeg video with the encoding set from Matroska to MPEG-4 and an output quality of perceptually lossless. After that, change the viewport display from solid to rendered by pressing this button up here. And also go to the junction of these two windows down here and click and drag to the left to create a new window over here. Now you can go ahead and change this window from the 3D viewport to the shader editor over here. You can press N to remove this side panel. Now we'll start off with our main object. So let's just select it, go to the material properties over here, click new to add a new material, and we'll call this glass, and we'll go down all the way to the settings and change the blend mode from opaque to alpha blend. We'll also switch off show backface and we'll check screen space refractions. Apart from that, we'll also change the shadow mode to none. The light now passes through the object and is clearly way too bright. So let's go to the light and just decrease the power to something like 10 and also increase the radius to something like 1 meter, just so that it's a very soft light. We'll be duplicating the lights a bit later, so we'll deal with that after we finish the material for our main orb. For our orb, we're going to go ahead and increase transmission all the way to 1 so that it becomes actual glass material, and we'll also reduce the roughness to something like 0.2 or 0.3. Now you can clearly see the refraction happening through it, and that looks great, but to make it look more visually appealing, we'll add in some emission lines as well as give it some bump. So first we'll add in a bump by searching for a noise texture and plugging it into a color ramp. So let's press Shift A and search for a color ramp and take the color, plug it into the factor, and then plugging the output of the color ramp into a bump node to convert it into normal data. So the color goes into the height, and we'll also decrease the strength of this to something like 0.1 and plug that normal into the normal of the principal PSDF. Immediately we get this nice bump effect in our glass, but it still seems too plain. So we'll go ahead and just add in some distortion, something like a value of 1, and that should be our glass material. However, we want it to also emit some lines. So we'll go ahead and press Shift D to duplicate the noise texture, also Shift D to duplicate the color ramp, plug the color into the color ramp, and we'll plug the output of the color ramp into a math node so that we can increase the bloom as well, and change the type from add to multiply, and then plug this color into the top socket, and we'll increase the bottom value to something like 10 for now, but we might increase that later, and plug that into the emission strength. Now further, to actually be some emission, we need to give the emission some color. So we'll go ahead and bring this all the way up and change the emission to this nice lemon green. Along with that, we'll just decrease the saturation to something like 0.95, and that's the color that we're going to be using. However, right now everything is lit up, so we have to reduce that by using the color ramp. So we can just bring it in quite a bit. And what we'll do is add in another marker and change this marker all the way to a bright white by selecting it, clicking down here and increasing this all the way to white, and then changing this one to black by selecting it, clicking the color over here and just bringing it down all the way to black. After that, you can just take this and bring it really close to the black, and then take this black marker and bring it really, really close, and that way you see it changes into just a line of light that goes through. Now the reason why we used a different color noise texture instead of this one itself is because with this new noise texture, you can actually increase the detail all the way to 15 and maybe increase the roughness as well to something like 0.7 just to make it look a lot cooler. Now you could leave it at the exact same scale, and that way it'll actually match the same lines of the bump map, which is going to be a little bit more noticeable if we had more objects in the scene. But since we don't, I'm actually going to reduce this scale to something like 3 and also reduce the actual band gap that we had over here by clicking this and just dragging it in, clicking this edge and also dragging that in till I have something super thin like this. Now this is what I want to go for, but clearly the brightness is not bright enough. So I'm just going to increase the multiply value to something like 50. And that is what's going to be our main object. Now with the main object, we require our planes to also be given a different material. So we've already added in the surface material for all of the planes. So we can just go ahead and select it. And in our materials window, just search for our material nodes. If you can't find it, a quick trick is pressing period on your numpad will bring everything into view. So once you do that, you can go ahead and do something very similar to what we did with our sphere. We'll press Shift A and search for a noise texture, and we'll search for a bump node, and we'll plug the color from the noise texture into the height of the bump node. And we'll go ahead and plug the normal from the bump node into the normal of the principal BSDF. And we won't really see anything because the scale of the noise texture is too small. So we'll increase it to something like 100 and immediately you'll be able to see it. Now, I think 100 is a bit too large. So we'll keep it at something like 20 and we'll increase the distortion to something like 3 just to get these nice cool textures. And with that, we can go ahead and just increase the metallicness to something very close to 1, maybe 0.95. And we can reduce the roughness to something like 0.2. Of course, you could use a noise texture to control the roughness, but I think that's a bit of an overkill for this particular scene because it already has a lot of things going on with these multiple rough bumps everywhere. So now we actually have to deal with the lighting. So let's choose our original light and go ahead and give it its material. For this material, we'll go ahead and give it a nice bluish color, but we'll make sure that it's not completely saturated. So maybe like a hue of 0.5 and a saturation of 0.7. And after that, we'll press Shift D to duplicate it and just grab it on the y-axis to move it back a little bit so that it's essentially just behind our sphere. And for that one, we'll increase the power to something like 100 and we'll change the color to this lemon green color. Again, we'll have to desaturate it. So we'll change the saturation to 0.95. Once you're happy with it, we can also select our camera, go down to viewport display, and just change passport out all the way to 1 so that we don't see anything outside our camera view. Now I feel like the light is a bit too bright, so I'll just decrease it to 50 watts and I'll increase the radius to 2 meters. So that's what we currently have. The next thing is actually dealing with our world settings. So in our shader panel, we can change it from object to world by clicking this button. And what we can do is just decrease the background all the way to black, and that'll remove most of whatever else could be seen. However, that also makes these areas become completely dark. So if you don't want that, you can actually give this a little bit of brightness, and instead you can search for a volume scatter node and just plug this into the volume of the world output. And of course, we're going to have to change the density to something really low, like 0.2. We can also increase the color to a complete white. So that way you get this particular effect. You can also increase anisotropy all the way to 1 or something close to 1. So we'll go with a density of 0.1 and an anisotropy of 0.6. Once you have that, we can start off the actual animation. So the animation is essentially going to be our camera looping around this object. So to do that, we'll press Shift A and add in an empty arrows. And we're going to have to select our camera and Shift select the empty arrows and press Ctrl P, set parent to object. Once you have that, you can expand your timeline a little bit, go back to frame 0, make sure you select just the empty and press I, rotation, then go all the way to frame 300, then press R, Z, 360, and then press I, rotation, and then come down here and press T, linear. That way, when you actually play the animation, you're going to go through one entire loop and it's going to be perfectly looping as well. You can also switch off the overlays by selecting this button up here. And of course, right now you're going to be seeing every single frame. But if you don't want to see that, you can go to playback and change play every frame to frame dropping, and you'll get a more realistic idea of the speed at which you're going to be rotating about the center. Now, of course, this looks like it's rotating pretty fast, but I think that's all right for the animation that we're going with. Another issue that you're facing, or at least I'm facing, is that since our green light was placed behind it, as we rotate to behind it, the green light comes in front of the camera, and that just doesn't look good in my opinion. So to change that, what we're going to do is go back to frame 0, choose the light 001, which was placed behind our original light, switch on overlays again, and with that selected, shift select our empty, and then press Ctrl P, set parent to object. That way, even the light is going to rotate around and it's always going to remain behind our object and it won't come in front of the camera and cause issues. So that's the type of animation that I'm going for. And I think you'll see it best when it's actually rendered out. And this is about it. A last tip that I'd like to give in case you were not happy with the actual displacement in your initial plane is that for the displacement, instead of changing the coordinates to global, you could also change the coordinates to some object and assign a separate empty for that. That way, you'd also get it to line up as long as you duplicate it. And you can always change the position of the empty to change the position of the bumps. So in certain areas like this, maybe the bump is a little too high and maybe for some people, they wouldn't like that. So all they could do is just take their empty and move it, and the bump would move as well. So if you actually want to see me do that, I can press Shift A, plane axes. And now with this selected, under the coordinates, I can change it from global to object. And for the object, I can select this particular plane. Now, suppose there's a bump here. I can actually always select the empty and just scale it down to change the way the bumps look. I can also grab it around and move it to move the bumps along as well. So those are just different things that you could do. And in fact, you could animate this as well. But I, again, think that that's an overkill for this particular animation for now. And I'll have quite a few videos where I explain doing that as well. So that's just another option that you have while creating your animation. Also, in my render properties, under color management, I'm going to change the look to high contrast, and that's just going to make it look more contrasty, and I think that looks better. So with that, the last thing that's left to do is click render animation. Hopefully you learned something from this video, and you can apply this to create various types of wallpapers. Be sure to check out Ducky 3D's tutorial as well, and I'm sure you'll learn something, especially if you're using Cycle's render engine. So until my next video comes out, don't forget to stay creative.